She carried a sketchbook everywhere she went, the kind her father bought her on her 9th birthday, thick cream pages, cloth cover, because he said she had a gift. She drew in full color, bright greens, warm reds, every shade of sky she'd ever seen. On the morning of May 22, 1992, 10-year-old Amelia Russell packed that sketchbook into her backpack, kissed her mother goodbye, and walked out the front door of her home in Clover Ridge, Ohio. She never made it to the end of her street. When investigators found her, 19 years later, she was still drawing, but only in pencil. She told them she couldn't remember what colors looked like anymore, that she'd tried once with the crayons her captor had given her, but the colors felt wrong, like they belonged to somebody else's life. So she'd put them away and never opened them again. This is the story of how a little girl disappeared from a safe neighborhood in broad daylight, how one man held her captive for nearly 2 decades inside an 8 by 10-foot shed, 30 feet from a public road, how probation officers walked past that shed 43 times and never once opened the door, and how one woman, a campus security officer with no detective training, looked at 2 quiet girls on a college campus and saw what an entire system had missed for 19 years. 3 streets away from the Russell house, a man had been watching the neighborhood for months. He had been patient. He had been planning. His name was Warren Hodges, and by the time anyone understood what he was, it was already too late. The town of Clover Ridge, Ohio, sits about 40 minutes outside of Columbus. In 1992, it was the kind of place parents still let their kids walk to friends' houses alone, where you waved at your neighbors by name and left your garage door unlocked. The Russell family had lived on Birchwood Drive for 6 years. Edward Russell worked at the county planning office. Claire Russell taught 2nd grade at Clover Ridge Elementary. They had 2 kids, Amelia, 10, and her younger brother, Danny, 7. Amelia was the kind of child teachers write home about, curious, gentle, stubborn in the good way. She had brown hair she wore in 2 braids, a slight gap between her front teeth, just wide enough to make her smile recognizable from across a room. And she had that sketchbook, always. You couldn't pry it from her hands, her father Edward would say years later. She drew everything she saw. I used to joke that if you wanted to know what our backyard looked like in 1991, just ask Amelia. On the morning of May 22nd, Amelia's best friend Sophie, who lived 4 streets over, was throwing a birthday party. Small thing. 4 girls, a cake, a movie. Claire offered to drive her. Amelia said no. She was 10. The party was 4 streets away. It was 11 in the morning. She'd walked it before. Claire watched her leave from the kitchen window, backpack on, sketchbook inside, yellow jacket because it was a little cool that morning. That was the last time Claire Russell saw her daughter for 19 years. Sophie called at 12:30, wondering where Amelia was. Claire assumed a mix-up on start time. She drove to Sophie's, then back home, then back to Sophie's, then to every house on every street between the 2 addresses. By 2 p.m., Edward was driving the neighborhood in his car. By 3 p.m., they had called the police. By nightfall, Clover Ridge was covered in search parties. They searched the creek behind the elementary school, the empty lot on Fairview, the wooded area behind the community center. They searched for 3 weeks. They found nothing. No yellow jacket, no backpack, no sketchbook, nothing. Just absence. The particular kind of absence that happens when a person vanishes completely and the world keeps going, And eventually you realize it is going to keep going regardless. Now, you might be thinking, this is a tragedy, a missing child, a family destroyed by grief. And it is all of those things. But here's what makes this case different from every other disappearance you've ever heard about. Not how Amelia vanished, how she was found. Because what Diana Parsons noticed on the campus of Millbrook Community College in September 2011 wasn't a crime scene. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't even suspicious at first glance. It was two girls who never smiled. And that small detail, two girls, no smiles, is what unraveled 19 years of silence. But to understand what Diana saw, you need to understand what happened in the first place. You need to understand Warren Hodges. Warren Hodges was 41 years old when Amelia Russell disappeared. He lived at 74 Elmcrest Lane in Clover Ridge, 3 streets from the Russell house. On paper, he looked like half the men in the county. Single-story house with vinyl siding, pickup truck in the driveway, small yard with a wooden privacy fence around the back. He ran a small printing business from a converted garage. Business cards, flyers, the kind of low-margin work that kept him self-employed without making him wealthy. He had one prior conviction, trespassing, 1987. 18 months served, released on parole. By 1992, his parole had technically expired, but he was still on the county's informal supervision list because his parole officer, a man named Neil Baker, had flagged some behavioral irregularities during the prior term that never quite resolved. Those are the official details. Here is what none of the official reports mention. Warren Hodges was methodical, careful, patient in a way that most people never noticed because most people aren't looking for patience as a warning sign. He'd spent 18 months in custody, reading psychology textbooks, not as a rehabilitation exercise, as research. In the margins of those books, he had noted specific passages about trauma bonding, learned helplessness, and the psychological mechanisms by which captives stop trying to escape. Those annotated books were found in his house in 2011, 19 years after he'd read them. He had been planning for a very long time. Now, before we go any further, I want to tell you something about Warren Hodges that the case file doesn't capture. Something that the investigators who read his journal described as the most unsettling thing about him. Not the planning, not the patience, not the psychology textbooks. This. He genuinely believed he was the most responsible person in Amelia Russell's life. He had constructed, over years, an internal logic in which the world outside was dangerous and chaotic and indifferent, and the shed was stable and controlled and safe. He wasn't performing that belief for anyone. There was no audience. He wrote about it in his journal the same way a person writes about a firmly held conviction, with certainty, with zero self-examination, with the calm tone of someone who has already settled the argument with himself and moved on. He believed he had saved her from something. That is not a monster's logic. It is something more disturbing than that. It is a completely intact, internally coherent worldview built on a rotten foundation. And the tragedy is that the foundation was laid so slowly, over so many years, that by the time investigators found it, he had lived inside it so long, he couldn't see the walls. That is what you are dealing with when you are dealing with Warren Hodges. Not chaos, not rage, not impulse, architecture. In the weeks before Amelia disappeared, 2 other girls in Clover Ridge had reported something strange. An 11-year-old on Fairview Road said a man in a dark pickup had rolled down his window and told her that her mother had called ahead and asked him to give her a ride home. She'd hesitated. The man had driven away. She hadn't told her parents until after Amelia went missing. A 12-year-old near the park said a man had asked her if she knew the Russell family. She'd said yes. He'd nodded slowly and driven off without asking anything else. 2 incidents, different days, same description. Male, dark pickup, unhurried manner. The detectives noted this, listed Warren Hodges as one of approximately 27 residents in the area who owned a dark-colored pickup. He was interviewed once, briefly, in June 1992. He was calm, cooperative, answered every question directly and without hesitation. He expressed appropriate concern about the missing child, said he hoped they found her soon. The detective who interviewed him wrote one line in his notes: "No concerns noted." Now, before we get to what was happening inside that fence, I need to explain something. Because when people hear a story like this, the first question is always the same. Why didn't she escape? It's a reasonable question. It deserves a real answer, not a surface answer, the real one. Because Warren Hodges didn't just build a physical prison, he built a psychological one first. And the psychological one was the one that actually worked. For the first several months, Amelia was restrained. The shed, 8 feet by 10 feet, built against the back fence, had been soundproofed before she arrived. Insulation, thick wood, a second interior wall. He'd done the work himself, over 2 years, in a way that looked like routine home improvement. His neighbors remembered it. One had even helped him carry the materials once. He said he was building a workshop, that neighbor told investigators in 2011. Seemed like a reasonable thing to do. No windows, one door, padlocked from outside. A small vent near the ceiling covered with mesh. A chemical toilet. A cot. He kept her restrained at first. A cable, padlocked to a bracket on the wall, long enough to reach the toilet, but not the door. And then he started talking to her. Every day. For hours. He wasn't cruel in the way most people imagine. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He sat outside the shed door and talked to her in a calm, even voice about what was happening in the world outside. He told her that her parents had moved away, that the house was for sale, that her brother had started at a new school, that life had gone on without her. None of it was true, but she had no way to know that. He told her about the dogs, 2 large German shepherds in the yard, trained to attack anyone who opened the door from the inside. There were no dogs, but she could hear him talking to them, calling them by name, feeding them. She could hear what she thought were their movements in the yard at night. What she was actually hearing, recordings. A small speaker mounted outside the shed wall. Dog sounds played every night for 2 years. 2 years of recorded dogs. That is the kind of man Warren Hodges was. By 1995, 3 years in, he removed the cable. He opened the shed door and told her she could step outside. She didn't. Not that day. Not for several more weeks. She had been in an 8 by 10 room for 3 years. She had been told, constantly and systematically, that the world outside had forgotten her, that her family was gone, that she had no home to return to. And here is the thing about the human mind under sustained psychological manipulation. It doesn't break dramatically, all at once, the way you see in movies. It adjusts, slowly, incrementally. The mind finds a way to accept its conditions because accepting is less painful than constant resistance. By 1995, Amelia Russell had, on some level, accepted that the shed was her world, not because she was weak, because she was human, and humans adapt. This is not a failure of character. It is a feature of the human brain that Warren Hodges had studied for 18 months and exploited for 3 years. Here is what I need you to hold on to as we move forward. The psychological prison was in place by 1995. That part of his plan had worked. But the physical world is harder to control than the psychological one, because Warren Hodges was on a supervision list. And supervision means home visits. And home visits mean a stranger. Someone with no reason to play along, someone with official authority, walking onto his property and looking around. 43 times, over 17 years. 43 times a probation officer or county welfare worker came to 74 Elmcrest Lane, rang the doorbell, walked through the house, made notes. 43 times that officer walked back to their car and drove away. And every single time, the shed in the backyard was described in the records as storage. That is what we need to understand next. The supervision visits at 74 Elmcrest Lane are documented in county records spanning 1993 to 2011. 43 home visits, 31 different officers. Because the caseload rotated, no single officer built enough familiarity with the property to notice what was changing year to year. Neil Baker, the supervising officer who had originally flagged Hodges for continued monitoring, retired in 1999. The file transferred to a rotating pool of caseworkers. When investigators went through those 43 reports in 2011, they found something that should have been impossible. In every single report, all 43, the shed was mentioned. Not as a concern, as a landmark. The property includes a rear shed used for storage. That phrase, or a version of it, appeared in every visit report, which meant every officer had seen it, every officer had noted it, and not one had ever asked what was inside. When investigators sat down with Neil Baker after the case broke, when they put those 43 reports in front of the man who had first supervised Warren Hodges, he said he remembered the shed from his early visits. Hodges had explained it was for business inventory, paper stock, extra equipment. Baker had looked at the padlock and thought nothing of it. Storage rooms have padlocks, he told investigators. That's normal. Then he put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. He said, I flagged him. I flagged him for a reason. And then I retired and handed it off, and that was the last time I thought about it. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Because here is the second thing that 43 visit record revealed. Between 2003 and 2009, 3 different caseworkers had each independently written a variation of the same sentence in their visit notes. Client appears cooperative. No concerns noted. The same language, different officers, different years. Investigators flagged this pattern, not because the language was identical, but because of what it suggested. Warren Hodges had learned exactly what to say to probation officers to close the conversation quickly. He had learned the language of compliance. He had learned how to end visits. One former caseworker, interviewed in 2011, said something that stayed with Detective Ruth McLean for the rest of her career. He always offered coffee, the caseworker said. First thing, every visit, before I even sat down. Can I get you something? Coffee? Water? Nobody else on my caseload did that. At the time, I thought it was good manners. Looking back, I think it was strategy. You walk into a house and someone offers you coffee. You're a guest. You're not looking for anything. You're visiting. 43 visits. 43 times the conversation opened with an offer of coffee. 43 times the shed stayed locked. In September 2000, when Amelia Russell had been missing for 8 years, the county issued a revised missing persons report. Her childhood photo was updated with an age progression image, what investigators estimated she'd look like at 18. That same month, county records show a welfare check was conducted at 74 Elmcrest Lane. The officer carried a photo of Amelia Russell in her case file, standard procedure when conducting checks in the broader Clover Ridge area. That officer spent 22 minutes at the property. She noted the shed. She noted the padlock. She wrote, "No concerns," in her report. She drove past the age progression image of Amelia Russell every single day, on a community bulletin board near the county building, the board where active missing persons cases were posted. She did not make the connection. Call it what you want. Oversight, carelessness, a system stretched too thin. All of those explanations are true, and none of them are sufficient, because they all point outward, at the caseload, at the form, at the institution, when the real answer is quieter and harder to name. Storage had been written on that report so many times, by so many different hands, that the word had stopped functioning as a description and started functioning as a door that, once closed, nobody felt the need to open again, because it had already been opened. 31 times, by 31 different people, and every single one of them had found storage. That is how things hide in plain sight. Not because no one is looking, because the looking already happened. The answer was already filed, and the shed stayed locked for another year. In 2007, 15 years after Amelia's disappearance, Warren Hodges began keeping a journal. He told investigators he started it because he was worried about memory degradation. He wanted to document his routines, his methods, what he'd learned about maintaining household order. That journal was recovered from a locked filing cabinet in his garage in 2011. 312 handwritten pages. The language throughout is clinical, almost academic. He refers to Amelia not by name, but as the ward. He refers to her 2 daughters, children born in captivity, aged 9 and 11 at the time of discovery, as the girls. He writes about their daily routines, their meals, their progress. He writes about the probation visits with a calm precision that investigators described as deeply disturbing. He documents each visit in advance, the scheduled date, his planned responses to likely questions, which rooms to show, which to redirect away from. One entry from March 2009 reads, "Quarterly assessment tomorrow. Baker's replacement, the one assigned last fall, overworked, end of fiscal quarter caseload pressure. Will offer coffee immediately. Keep living room discussions centered on printing business income and community engagement. Redirect if she moves toward backyard. No reason she will. 41 visits without incident. Familiarity is its own protection." 41 visits without incident. He counted them. He tracked them the way a person tracks a security system they've learned to disarm. Not with anxiety, with satisfaction. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Familiarity is its own protection. It appears in 4 separate entries. He returned to it repeatedly, the way a person returns to something that has proven itself true. He had watched it work for 15 years. He had tested it 41 times, and it had held 41 times. He had built his entire system of concealment on one observation: that human beings stop examining what they've already categorized. That routine creates blindness. He was right. That is the most disturbing thing in those 312 pages. Not the clinical language, not the planning. The fact that he was right. A man with a psychology textbook and 18 months of patience had correctly identified a flaw in how institutions conduct oversight, and he had exploited that flaw for nearly 2 decades without a single officer catching it. And here is the thing that Ruth McLean said she couldn't stop thinking about the night she finished reading the journal. It wasn't the entries about the girls that haunted her. It was the coffee entries. "Will offer coffee immediately." 43 times, a person with official authority walked onto that property. 43 times, the very first thing that happened was a warm gesture, a small, humanizing act, something that said, "We are neighbors. We are civilized people. Here is something warm. Sit down. Relax." And 43 times, that gesture worked. He had understood something that the entire supervision system had failed to account for: that kindness can be architecture, that warmth can be a lock, that the most effective way to stop someone from looking is to make them feel there is nothing to look for. Ruth McLean closed the journal, put it in an evidence bag, and drove home. She sat in her car in her driveway for a long time before she went inside. What he didn't understand, what those 312 pages never account for, is that familiarity cuts both ways. The visits had become routine for him. But one day, somewhere outside his carefully managed world, something was going to happen that his preparation couldn't reach. One day, he was going to be visible to someone who hadn't already decided what they were seeing. Diana Parsons had been a campus security officer at Millbrook Community College for 9 years. Not a detective, no special training in missing persons or criminal profiling. Her job, as she described it, was to keep things calm and keep people safe. She was good at it, methodical, observant, the kind of person who notices what doesn't fit. In September 2011, Warren Hodges had begun bringing his daughters to the Millbrook campus 3 mornings a week. He'd recently contracted with the college's communications department to produce printed materials, brochures, event flyers, program guides. He needed helpers to carry samples and manage deliveries. He brought the girls. The first time Diana saw them, she thought, something is off. She couldn't name it, not yet. Just a tightness in her chest, watching them walk behind Warren Hodges across the campus quad. They were young, she guessed 14 and 12. Pale in a way that suggests not enough sunlight. They walked closely together, slightly behind him, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. That wasn't the thing that caught her. The thing that caught her was what they didn't do. They didn't look around. Diana had watched thousands of people walk across that quad over 9 years. Students, faculty, visitors, children on field trips. Everyone looks around. It's what humans do when they enter a new space. The eyes move, they scan, they take in information. It's involuntary. These 2 girls didn't look around. Their eyes stayed fixed on the back of Warren Hodges as he walked. When someone passed near them, even at a distance of 10 feet, both girls pulled slightly inward, shoulders rising. Diana watched this for 3 visits. Now, What Diana did next is important, because she didn't immediately call the police. She didn't make an accusation. She did something that the investigators who later worked this case called the single most important act of observation in the entire 19-year timeline. She paid attention for one more visit. On that fourth visit, September 19th, 2011, she watched Warren Hodges stop to speak with a college administrator near the building entrance. The two girls stood behind him, waiting. And while he was distracted, a campus cat, a tabby that wandered the quad, something of a college mascot, walked up to the younger girl and butted its head against her shin. Diana was watching from 40 feet away. The girl looked down at the cat, and for a single unguarded moment, maybe 3 seconds, something crossed her face. Not fear, not blankness, wonder. Raw, unfiltered wonder, like she was seeing something alive and warm and unexpected for the first time in her life. Then Warren Hodges finished his conversation and turned around. The girl's face went blank again, instantly, like a light switching off. Diana stood very still. She had been doing this job for 9 years. She had learned, over hundreds of shifts and thousands of people, to trust the feeling that something wasn't right. She had filed dozens of reports on much thinner instincts than this, and right now that feeling was not a whisper, it was a shout. She went inside and filed a report within the hour. The report reached Detective Ruth McLean on September 21st, 2011. Ruth had been on the missing persons unit for 6 years. She had worked dozens of cold cases, many of them children. She had learned early that cases which get solved are almost never solved by evidence. They're solved by someone who sees something everyone else walked past. She read Diana's report twice. Then she pulled up the county's active missing persons files for Clover Ridge and the surrounding area. Amelia Russell, missing since May 22, 1992. Age 10 at disappearance. Last address, Birchwood Drive, Clover Ridge. Then she pulled Warren Hodges' address, 74 Elmcrest Lane, 3 streets from Birchwood Drive. Then she requested the full supervision visit record. 43 visits. 1 note in all 43. Rear shed used for storage. She sat with that for a long time. Then she called Colin James, the patrol officer assigned to the Millbrook area, and told him to meet her at 74 Elmcrest Lane the following morning. Bring a reason to look in the shed, she told him. They arrived at 8:12 a.m. on September 23, 2011. Warren Hodges answered the door immediately. Calm, polite. He offered coffee. Ruth declined. She told him they had received a welfare inquiry related to 2 minors observed in his company on the Millbrook campus. Routine follow-up, nothing to be concerned about. She watched his face as she said it. He nodded, invited them in. Cooperative, measured, every word chosen carefully. He explained the girls were his daughters, homeschooled. He brought them to work sometimes for educational purposes. He spoke about them with warmth. He gestured to photographs on the wall, 2 girls at various ages, staged domestic scenes, Christmas and birthdays. Everything looked right. Then Ruth asked if she could see the backyard. A pause, brief. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. Ruth noticed. Warren Hodges said, of course. Opened the back door, walked them out onto the patio. Tidy yard, fence in good repair, a small garden along one side, and at the far end, against the back fence, the shed, 8 feet by 10, padlock on the door. Ruth walked toward it. What's in here? Storage, Warren Hodges said. Business materials, paper stock. Ruth turned to look at him. Mind opening it? Another pause, longer. I don't have the key on me, he said. It's inside. We'll wait, Ruth said. That was the moment. He had two options. He chose the wrong one. He went inside to look for the key. 4 minutes. When he came back, he said he couldn't find it. Somewhere in his office. He could bring it by the station that afternoon. Ruth looked at Colin James. Colin James looked at the padlock. We'll need to open this now, Ruth said. Warren Hodges said, You don't have the authority to. We have a welfare inquiry involving minors, Ruth said. We have grounds. Open the door, Mr. Hodges. He opened the door. The first thing was darkness. The second thing was the cots. 2 of them. One low single bed against the left wall, another in the back right corner. The third thing was the smell. Closed air, chemical cleanser, something underneath that neither officer could name, but that lodged in the back of the throat and stayed there. Colin James stepped in first. He'd been a patrol officer for 11 years. He had walked into difficult rooms before. Rooms with things in them that didn't wash out of memory easily. He moved his flashlight across the space, and then he stopped. In the beam of that light, against the far wall, 2 girls, both sitting up, both awake, both watching him with expressions that were not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had learned to present as calm. The older girl pressed herself flat against the wall when he stepped in. The younger one did something different. She looked at the light, not at Colin, at the beam of the flashlight itself, at the way it moved through the dusty air. She watched it like something beautiful. Colin James stood there for a moment without speaking. 11 years of patrol work, hundreds of calls. He had trained for rooms with threats in them. He had not trained for this. He told Ruth McLean later, they were so quiet, both of them. And the thing that hit me, the thing I couldn't get out of my head afterward, was that they weren't scared of us. They were just waiting. Like they already knew how to be found. Like they'd done it before in their heads so many times that when it actually happened, they knew exactly how to hold still for it. Ruth McLean stepped in after him. She looked around. The cots, the small shelf with its careful organization of books and papers, the chemical toilet in the corner, the thick insulation lining every wall, the single vent near the ceiling, mesh-covered. Then she looked at the 2 girls. Hi, she said. Not official, not procedural, just a word. Neither girl responded. My name is Ruth. We're here to help you. You're not in trouble. Silence. Then, from the corner near the older girl, pushed slightly under the edge of the cot, like something hidden and protected, Ruth saw the edge of something. A book. Thick, cloth-covered. A sketchbook. She crouched down and gently pulled it out. She opened to the first page. A drawing of a cat. Pencil. Careful, meticulous lines. The proportions exact. The texture of the fur rendered in tiny, patient strokes. She turned the page. A vent. The mesh pattern drawn in precise detail. Another page. A crack in the wall. Every hairline branch of it documented. Page after page of pencil drawings. All of them interior. All of them drawings of the shed itself, its walls, its corners, its objects, its textures. The world rendered in careful, patient pencil, over and over and over again. She had been drawing the only world she had. Ruth looked up at the older girl. "Is this yours?" A pause, then, so quietly it was almost nothing. "Yes." Ruth said, "You're a very good artist." The girl looked at the sketchbook. Then, for the first time, she looked at Ruth. Ruth said, "What's your name?" A longer pause. "They call me—" She stopped, swallowed. "He calls me—" She stopped again. Ruth waited. Something crossed the girl's face, the look of someone reaching for something they once knew and finding the memory blurred and uncertain, like trying to read a sign through frosted glass. "My name," she said very quietly. I don't use it." Ruth said, "Take your time." The girl closed her eyes. "Amelia," she said. "My name is Amelia." Warren Hodges was taken into custody that morning without resistance. He did not shout, he did not run, he did not beg or bargain. He stood in his backyard and watched the officers lead Amelia and the two girls toward the gate. And he said one thing. Colin James heard it clearly. He wrote it in his report that afternoon because he didn't want to be the only person holding it. Warren Hodges said, "She was safer here." He believed it. That was the thing that stayed with every investigator who worked this case. He wasn't performing for an audience. He wasn't constructing a legal argument in that moment. There was no courtroom, no judge, no one he needed to convince. He said it to no one in particular, in the same quiet, even voice he had used for 43 home visits and 312 journal pages. He said it like a fact. That is the most disturbing sentence in this entire story. Not because it's monstrous, because it reveals what happens when a person builds a logic system from a rotten foundation and then lives inside it long enough. The system becomes reality. The walls become invisible. The conviction becomes complete. He had convinced himself, and unlike Amelia Russell, he had had 19 years to do it, undisturbed. The medical and psychological assessment of Amelia Russell on September 23, 2011, began with a doctor sitting down across from a 29-year-old woman and asking, gently, how she was feeling. Amelia said she didn't know how to answer that question. Not because she was unwell, because she had spent so long in a space where feelings were managed rather than expressed, where the wrong emotion at the wrong moment had consequences, that the simple act of answering honestly felt like stepping onto ground she wasn't sure would hold her. She was in reasonable physical health, no significant malnutrition, no untreated injuries. Warren Hodges had kept her alive with a terrible consistency because he needed her to be. But physical health and psychological health are two completely different countries, and Amelia Russell was living in the wreckage of the second one. She could read and write. She'd never stopped. She had a child's education that she had extended on her own, through whatever books he'd provided, through her drawing, through the private life of the mind that Warren Hodges had never been able to reach, no matter how thoroughly he had controlled everything else. That is worth pausing on. Through 19 years in a shed, through everything he had taken and managed and directed and controlled, there was one place he could not go. Her mind, when she was drawing, was entirely her own. She chose pencil because pencil was what she had. She chose the shed's walls and vents and cracks because that was the only world available to her. But the act of drawing, The decision to look closely at a thing, to render it, to make it permanent on paper, that was hers. It had always been hers. It was the one thing he had given her access to and never understood the significance of. She had been drawing herself a record of her own existence for 19 years. She had never stopped being Amelia. The psychological assessment was complex and ongoing. She had profound difficulty with outdoor spaces, open rooms, crowds. She had near complete dissociation from her identity prior to May 1992. The girl from Birchwood Drive felt theoretical to her, almost like a character she had heard described rather than a person she remembered being. She had 2 daughters, 9 and 11, both born in the shed, both alive, both physically healthy, both carrying their own separate weight of things that would take years to understand and longer to begin to heal. The older one, the girl who had pressed herself against the wall when Colin James stepped in, had learned stillness as a survival skill. She could hold herself motionless and expressionless for long stretches. She had learned this the way children learn everything, by watching the adult in the room and doing what kept things calm. The younger one, the girl who had looked at the flashlight beam like it was beautiful, had inherited something else from her mother. She drew constantly, on any surface available to her, with whatever she could find. She drew the vent, the crack in the wall, the cot. She drew in pencil because that was all she had, just like her mother. Edward and Claire Russell were notified by Detective Ruth McLean on the morning of September 23rd. Edward Russell had spent 19 years doing 2 things simultaneously: believing his daughter was alive somewhere and preparing himself for the day he was told she wasn't. He had lived in that suspension, hope and grief held side by side, unresolved, for nearly 2 decades. When Ruth called, he was 61 years old. He was sitting at the same kitchen table in the same house on Birchwood Drive where Claire had watched Amelia leave for Sophie's birthday party in 1992. They had never sold the house. Ruth told him they had found Amelia, that she was alive, that she was safe. He said he didn't speak for several minutes. He just held the phone. When he could speak, the first thing he asked was, "Does she remember us?" Ruth said, "We're going to work on that together." The family reunion is documented in the assessment records, though the details have been kept private at the family's request. What is known, it took Amelia several months before she was able to spend extended time with her parents. The memories were there, fragments, images, a feeling of warmth attached to certain sounds, but they were buried under 19 years of architecture designed to make her believe those things were gone. It takes a long time to unbuild what was built in that shed. That process is ongoing. Warren Hodges stood trial in 2013. He was convicted on multiple counts. His defense argued that Amelia had ultimately been a willing participant, that she'd had opportunities to leave and chosen not to, that the children were raised in a stable environment, that he had provided for them. The prosecution's expert witnesses spent 3 days explaining, in precise clinical terms, exactly why none of that is how captivity and psychological manipulation work. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. At sentencing, the judge read each count aloud before pronouncing the term. There were 11 counts. He read all 11. The courtroom was silent for each one, not dramatically, not the way silence works in movies, quietly. The specific quiet of a room full of people trying to hold the weight of what they're hearing and finding they cannot. Warren Hodges showed no visible reaction to any of it. Consecutive terms, no possibility of early release. During sentencing, Amelia Russell submitted a written statement. She did not attend the trial. The statement was read aloud by the prosecutor. 4 sentences. I don't want to talk about what was done to me. I don't want to talk about him at all. I want to say one thing to anyone who reads this. My daughters drew their first picture in colors last week. Amelia Russell was 31 years old when she gave her daughters their first box of colored pencils. The social worker present that day wrote about it in her case notes, not because she was required to, because she couldn't not. Amelia's older daughter opened the box slowly, looked at the colors arranged in their row, touched each one with the tip of her finger, the red, the orange, the deep green. The way you touch something you have heard about, but never held. Then she looked up at her mother. Amelia turned to the window. Outside, a real yard, open sky, the first autumn leaves coming down in red and orange and yellow. Like that, Amelia said. Draw it like that. Her daughter picked up the red pencil and started drawing. This story is not only about Warren Hodges. It is about the 43 visits. After the case broke, the county reviewed its supervision protocols and found what you would expect. Caseloads too large, no requirement to document outbuildings, no concerns used as a reflex rather than a conclusion. They also found that at least 4 caseworkers had noticed something they described to colleagues as a feeling, a sense that something wasn't right at the Hodges property. None of them had put it in a report. There was no section of the form for a feeling. One of those caseworkers said, I told my supervisor, there's something about that house. He asked if I had evidence. I said no. He said, then there's nothing to report. There's nothing to report. That is the gap. Not one dramatic failure, 43 ordinary ones. The space between what a person feels and what the form has a box for. Diana Parsons didn't have a form. She had a security log and an instinct she had spent 9 years learning to trust. 2 girls who didn't look around. A child who looked at a cat like it was the most remarkable thing she'd ever seen. She wrote it down. That is what made the difference. Amelia Russell drew in pencil for 19 years. Her daughters are drawing in color now. If you were sitting here thinking, I would have noticed something, maybe you would have. The real question is whether you'd have written it down. If you made it this far, you already know what this channel is about. Subscribe. New story coming soon.